Well, it's back to school time here in Europe, and France has been testing a mobile phone ban in hundreds of middle schools. It is part of what is being called a digital pause for school kids. Now, several countries in Europe are debating whether to ban students from having smartphones while in school. If the trial is deemed a success, it could lead to a nationwide ban next year.
Back to school will be different for tens of thousands of students in France this fall. Now, they have to hand in their smartphones before they can head to class.
We're experimenting to see whether it works. The earlier we deal with the addiction to these phones, the better.
France is rolling out this experiment, which it calls a digital pause, across 180 middle schools. It's part of a move by France's government to limit the time children spend on screens, over fears it can hinder their development. While students were already required to turn off phones in class, now the devices will have to stay locked away for the entire duration of the school day, including during recess.
It gets students used to being without their phones all day and teaches them to live differently, even during recess, instead of being on their phones.
France isn't the only EU country cracking down on phones in schools. The Netherlands, Greece, and Belgium have rolled out similar restrictions on smart devices. Parents here said they were on board with the ban.
As long as I can reach him when he's on the road, to find out where he's at, the ban's no problem for me. It's reassuring his phone won't get stolen or lost.
France's phone ban experiment comes ahead of a possible plan to enforce it nationwide from 2025.
So, who better to discuss this with than Sarah Rose, a senior lecturer in developmental psychology at Staffordshire University in the UK. Hello. So, this is a conversation across so many countries. Just to start things off, how are things done in the UK? Are there restrictions on phones in schools?
Yes, there are. So it's a kind of fast-changing agenda, really, isn't it? So since February, there's been guidance in the UK that phones should be not in schools. They should be banned in schools. It's still down to individual schools how they kind of enforce and develop a policy around banning mobile phones. So in some schools, that might mean there's no phones on the school premises and children are expected to leave phones at home with parents. In other schools, that might mean that schools are handed in, like we were just hearing about in France, at the beginning of the school day and not returned until the end of the school day. In other schools, that might simply mean that phones are still with children, but they should be never seen and never heard. And that would include in break times between lessons. So there is still some flexibility for schools in terms of how they choose to ban phones in schools, but the guidance is around banning phones here as well in the UK now.
Now, some of that might be making school children quite nervous to hear that that's what's going ahead. You have written, though, that simply banning phones, that could be missing out on an opportunity. Can you tell me what you meant by that?
Absolutely. So this is based on research that we did a couple of years ago when the variability of what schools did was much greater. And we spoke to children and their parents together, and we spoke to them about their views and also their views on different kind of mobile phone policies that schools had at that time. And we were really surprised how maturely children spoke about mobile phone use, and we were really surprised at the strength of views that parents had that were not supportive of complete bans in schools. Parents instead felt that phones were really important for keeping in contact with their child, both at the end of the school day, at the beginning of the school day on that journey to and from school, but also while they were at school. There's a lot of thought around actually digital resilience and exposing children to risk and encouraging children to make mature, sensible decisions. And I think that allowing children to have mobile phones on them, but having school policies and procedures in schools where we try and encourage children to not use their phone when it's not appropriate, but to still have access to their phone, could help prepare them for the real world. And the fact that digital technology, phones are increasingly there, we have to learn to manage these distractions. Of course,
a real world where we're very much always all on our phones, aren't we? I do have to ask you, though, there's a current study here in Germany from the University of Augsburg. It shows that banning smartphones in schools actually increases the social well-being of students. Are you surprised to hear that result?
I'm not surprised. There have been a number of studies looking at well-being of children in relation to mobile phone bans. And to be honest, they've actually found quite conflicting results. Some studies have found that actually bans can harm children's well-being at school, that they have lower well-being in situations where there are bans. Other studies, like the one you mentioned in Augsburg, suggest that actually they can be beneficial. And then there's some studies in the middle that find really it isn't seeming to have a massive impact on well-being. And it's similar when we look at things like educational attainment as well. It seems that banning mobile phones can be beneficial, maybe to some pupils that maybe are slightly lower attaining pupils that maybe aren't doing quite so well at school. But when we look overall and we look at high achieving pupils, it doesn't seem to have the same effects. I think it's very easy to say we will ban phones at school. I think currently it's a popular line that governments are choosing to take. But if we look at places such as Canada, some areas of New York where bans have been in place for much longer, there are now some instances of bans being revoked because actually they're deciding that that isn't the best route forwards anymore.
So just very briefly, I'm afraid we've only just got about under a minute left, but in your view then, you think probably some restrictions useful, but a complete ban not the way to go?
Absolutely. I think it depends on the school, the setting, the age of the children, the maturity of the children. But I think that it could provide a real opportunity to work with children and parents to engage them in meaningful conversations about responsible mobile phone use. So rather than a complete ban, thinking about engaging with the pupils, having conversations about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and maybe even developing a policy together which pupils feel is going to be beneficial to them. By developing it with pupils, it may make it easier for teachers to enforce.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today with those insights. That is Sarah Rose from Staffordshire University in the UK. We very much appreciate your time.
Thank you.